Good evening, everyone. My name's Paul Barnes. I'm a serving soldier based at the Land Warfare Centre in Warminster in Wiltshire. Tonight, I'm going to talk about aerial resupply in the First World War, which is a very niche area. So why did I come to study this? Well, this is part of this was the dissertation for my master's degree from Birmingham University, and effectively there were three influences on this. The first was that I'd spent about six years with 16 Air Assault Brigade based over in Essex and Suffolk, and I'd also done 3 years as the chief clerk of 47 Air Dispatch Squadron, Royal Logistic Corps, which is Defence's indigenous capability that allows it to resupply troops on the ground, be that to the 16th Air Assault Brigade, or be that to slightly more niche capabilities. Wider than that, I have a relative who is buried at Al-Amara, which is in Iraq, and he died in the siege of Kut in 1916, and I was lucky enough to go and see his grave when I was serving in Iraq in 2003. The third is a nice little story, I suppose, just to get us warmed up. When I was on Optelic 2, which was the British operation in southern Iraq, I visited Kut-Al-Amara to go and speak to the US Marine Corps, who were based there. We went out to an airfield and we went to one of these sort of blow-up tents that the Americans have, and I was waiting outside in the Land Rover while my OC was inside talking to the senior officers. I took myself across to the usual thing that attracts soldiers, a large heap of weapons, which had been captured from insurgents and from the Iraqi army. And there and amongst them, I found three SMLE rifles. I asked about them, and the American who was there said, oh, they were captured. They were found in a garden in Kut. The guy said he knew nothing about them, and they were wrapped in sort of Hessian, which was very old, but we know he's an insurgent. And I had a look at them and found the markings for the 6th Indian Division on them. Those three rifles we took back with us, and they are currently at the King's Own Scottish Borderers Museum in Berwick-upon-Tweed. So those are really my motivations for wanting to do this subject. So what are we going to talk about tonight? So in the first instance, I'm going to talk about aerial resupply at Kut-Al-Amara, the siege of Kut in April 1916, part of the Mesopotamia Campaign. Then we're going to talk about aerial resupply at Le Hamel. And that's those two battles, rather actions, are going to be our central activity for the evening. But I'm going to talk a lot around the themes of innovation and adaptation, inter-theatre learning, influence and patronage. And influence and patronage are really, really important. So the key historian of the air war in the Australian element of the air war is a guy called Michael Morkentin, who is a superb historian, and he has this to say about aerial resupply. Like most of the roles for air power that emerged in the war's first 18 months, aerial resupply indicates reasonable foresight. The aeroplane would come to occupy an important part in the supply chains of military forces later in the 20th century. In 1915, however, the vision outstripped the available technology. Well, we're gonna talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But what I'm going to do is give you a background to aerial resupply. So where does it come from? Well, it comes from a significantly earlier part of the theory, at least, comes from a significantly earlier time. In 1911 at Hendon, the Parliamentary Aerial Defence Committee had a look at a capability which was and I quote, the dropping of limited quantities of ammunition and food supplies to beleaguered garrisons or in other emergencies. Later, obviously in 1912, at the army manoeuvres in Norfolk, where we have Grierson and Haig battling it out, and with Grierson using the air component quite heavily. 2 seconds. Using the air component quite heavily, we see the advantage of air power. Then in 1914, message dropping becomes quite prevalent, and then in January 1916, we have the dropping of newspapers and mail at Kut. So dropping and resupplying from the air is not a new idea in 1916. It is 4 or 5 years old, and there are people who are talking around the subject quite readily. We'll now flick over to talk about the Mesopotamia Campaign. So the British invasion of Mesopotamia in early November 1914 was ostensibly a sensible extension of British foreign policy in the Persian Gulf. In the century prior to 1914, British policy towards the Ottoman Empire had been one of managed decline and preserving regional stability. When war came, and despite the misgivings of the Viceroy of India, Lord Hardinge, who believed that any operation which compromised the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire risked turning Muslim religious loyalty into open rebellion throughout the British Empire, the British Indian Army was given the task of securing the Mesopotamian oil fields and pipelines at the head of the Persian Gulf. The force, Indian Expeditionary Force D, IEFD, consisted of the 6th Indian Division under Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Barrett, easily achieved its limited objectives and was rapidly reinforced with a 2nd Division, the 12th Indian Division, under Major General George Gorringe, and the 6th Indian Cavalry Brigade under Major General Sir Charles Mellis, VC. The ease with which the force captured its objectives encouraged a degree of hubris, leading to what would be termed in the 21st century mission creep. The political advisor of the expedition, Sir Percy Cox, and Barrett's replacement as force commander, Lieutenant General Sir John Nixon, devised an ambitious plan to advance up the Tigris River in order to capture Baghdad. Importantly, while Nixon's plan had the tacit support of the government of India, Whitehall was both against any extension in the operation and blind to the advanced plans for that operation. Climate and geography made all military operations in Mesopotamia, but especially cavalry reconnaissance and artillery observation, extremely difficult. Transport was largely limited to the rivers. The ground was either marshland or desert. Fodder was virtually non-existent, and artillery observation, still at this time by direct fire only, was obscured by heat hazes. Nixon recognized that the aeroplane could fill the capability gap and requested that GHQ India provide aerial reconnaissance and artillery observation assets for the advance of the 6th Division under Major General Sir Charles Townshend. Let's talk about Townshend. Chitral Charlie, as he is pejoratively known. So Sir Charles Townshend is a very interesting character. Charlie Townshend came from a lower middle class background himself, although his grandfather was Lord Townshend and was descended from the commander-in-chief who had led Wolfe's expedition to Canada and had been a field marshal. Townshend never lost sight of the fact that he'd come from lower roots, and was always seeking to publicize himself. He joined the Royal Marine Light Infantry in the early 1880s and managed by letters backwards and forwards to Lord Wolseley to get himself on the Gordon Relief Expedition. He attended that, fought at the Battle of Abu Klea, went on a little bit further and fought in the Burma campaign in the 1890s, and then again on into the Boer War, each time publicizing himself and moving himself up. But the key element that everyone knows him from, and why he's called Chitral Charlie, is because he famously was besieged at Chitral on the northwest frontier, and held out for over a month against huge numbers of Pathan insurgency, if you like, until he was relieved. As soon as he got that, he publicized his story widely, getting to meet the Queen, and that's where he gets his DSO from that operation. So we've got the army moving up. Chitral Charlie is leading what's called Townsend's Regatta. Effectively, he pulled together everything that would float, put his army on it, and rapidly moved up to Amara, and then from past Kurna to Amara, up past Kut, up to a place called Ctesiphon. It is there that he's engaged by a huge army of the Turks, who effectively throw him back. He then heads back into Kut and holds himself up in the same old fashion. He's used to being besieged. His reasons for that are twofold. One, that by holding his position there, he is protecting the rest of the army further downriver, because the Turks cannot bypass him. They have to fight his army or his division, 6th Division, tied up in Kut. The second one is that his men are so exhausted and their supplies are so limited that he probably couldn't have made it back to Amara without having to have another fight with the Turks, which he doubted he could survive. So that gives us the background. He's holed up in Kut from the end of November 1915. So now we're going to flick on, and we're going to talk about what we've come to talk about, really, the aviation in Mesopotamia 1914-16. So the story of aviation in Mesopotamia is one of the creation of an air force from a standing start in less than 4 months. Many of the problems from which IEFD aviation component would later suffer can be traced directly to its founding: insufficient aeroplanes, poor logistics, and weak administration. GHQ India had virtually no aeroplanes in its inventory in 1915, and almost all its trained aircrew were already serving with the RFC on the Western Front. Following a negative response from Whitehall, the government of India requested that the governments of Australia and New Zealand provide aircrew and ground personnel to support IEFD. These governments agreed to provide a half flight of 30 personnel under the temporary command of Captain Henry Peter of the Australian Flying Corps. He was a former chief instructor at the Australian Central Flying School at Point Cook. This unit was to be facilitated by aircraft and an organizational architecture provided by GHQ India. Major Peter Brooke-Smith, Royal Engineers, a former chief instructor at the British Central Flying School, was appointed as the Deputy Assistant Director Aviation on the staff of IEFD, with responsibility for providing Nixon with advice on aviation matters and creating and running an aviation infrastructure in support of the flight, with facilities in India and in Mesopotamia. In addition to Brooke-Smith, a flight commander, Captain H.L. Riley of the 82nd Punjabis, and an engineering officer, Captain W.R. Wills, Indian Army Reserve of Officers. And he's really important. If we can try to remember that name, you'll see he bobs up shortly, were appointed by GHQ India in March 15. Critically, however, they were appointed with no organic administrative support. Brooke-Smith would have less than 2 months to prepare the aviation component for operations. The inevitable lack of preparedness would necessitate an organizational dependence on innovation and initiative, which, whilst laudable, would have ramifications for the provision of air support. The half-flight arrived in Basra on the 26th of May, 1915, left its mule transport and found that Brooke-Smith had already established an aerodrome and a park at Basra for the repair and assembly of aeroplanes, and a depot at Bombay under the command of Captain E.L. Baxter, Indian Army Reserve of Officers, providing spares, equipment, tooling, and theatre reception for all personnel. The aeroplanes they were expected to operate were two Henry Farman Shorthorns. The Shorthorn is the second in from the right at the bottom. Unfortunately, these were still in crates, and over the next 2 days, these aircraft were put together by the engineers on the ground, built from nothing. And indeed, 2 days later, they were actually in the air providing operations without ever having been tested. What Brooke-Smith was trying to look for was 3 flights. He had enough for 2 aircraft, 1 flight, and he was already trawling the IEFD for officer volunteers for aircrew training. He'd also requested float planes to take advantage of the rivers, lakes, and marshes. Brooke-Smith was clearly industrious. In the space of 2 months, he traveled from India to Mesopotamia, identified suitable operating and accommodation facilities, built an aerodrome, infrastructure and workshops, and organized precious river transport assets to support the advance to Baghdad. Additionally, in his role as staff officer, he was advising Nixon of the aircraft types and number he would need for the next phase of operations. It's apparent, however, that whilst the aviation organization was not short on adaptability and drive, with such a Herculean workload, day-to-day administration, including knowledge capture, was poor. The frenetic attempt of those first few days certainly encouraged innovation and adaptation, but was unsustainable. It's notable that of all Brooke-Smith's written replies at requests at this time, they're all handwritten on notepad paper and in pencil, despite being a staff officer in a fairly large headquarters. In addition to this, insanitary conditions, the effects of heat and other illnesses took a heavy toll on the limited manpower available. The half-flight commenced operations in support of Townsend's Tigris advance on the 28th of May, 1915. The initial advance culminated in the capture of Al-Amara on the 3rd of June, 1915. Although success in providing a reconnaissance and rudimentary artillery observation, the aviation capability was already under severe strain and far from what was commonplace on the Western Front at the time. Indeed, on the 16th of June 15, Brooke-Smith was reminded by Nixon's HQ excuse me, that his role was that of a staff officer, not an operational pilot. Brooke-Smith was clearly struggling to balance his role as a staff officer with a requirement to both administrate the aviation capability and cover flying missions, thus highlighting the immaturity of the organization and the inexperience of Brooke-Smith's subordinates. Nixon's decision to divide his force to advance up the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers simultaneously further exacerbated the problems for the half-flight, with 2 operational aeroplanes being used on both fronts from the 22nd of June 15. The half-flight had not at this stage received any further aircraft, and the intense heat and illness rates were beginning to take a heavy toll on aircraft and manpower. Nixon recognized the value of his aviation assets and understood that without reinforcement, their outputs were unsustainable. His request for additional aeroplanes and aircrew, whilst accepted positively in India and Australia and New Zealand, could not be provided immediately. In these circumstances, and given the change in the campaign's status since November 14, and the ongoing offensive operations in the Dardanelles and Egypt, the War Office asserted its authority, absorbed the half-flight into No. 30 Squadron Royal Flying Corps as A flight, and added a B flight from Egypt. Simultaneously, the personnel of the half-flight were taken on the British establishment, with all commissions converted to the Royal Flying Corps. So although the role of Dada, Deputy Assistant Director Aviation, remained, Brooke-Smith lost authority over the flying component, being limited to providing advice to IEFD. Major S.D. Massey, Royal Flying Corps, was appointed to command the squadron, and Captain Riley relegated to command of A flight, with Captain E.M. Murray of the Queen's Queen Victoria's own Corps of Guides, commanded B Flight. The effect in material terms on the aviation capability was immediate. From late August 1915, the number of aeroplanes was doubled to 8, albeit they were Martinsyde S-1 aircraft, which were obsolete on the Western Front at the time. Critically, however, little changed in terms of administration, and although much had been learnt by Brooks-Smith, his staff, and the personnel of the half-flight, particularly in relation to flying in extreme temperatures, the lack of a mechanism to formalize learning was a problem. Brooks-Smith's influence was further challenged in September 1915 with the arrival of a seaplane detachment commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Gordon, Royal Marine Light Infantry, an experienced pilot who had commanded an RNAS seaplane detachment, excuse me, in action against the German battlecruiser Königsberg in Tanganyika. Gordon's rank created a problem for HQ IAFD. He outranked both Brooks-Smith and Massey, but commanded far fewer airplanes and personnel than either, and was wholly inexperienced in operations in the desert. After a good deal of correspondence, including a discussion of their relative seniority and the dates of their commissioning, a la Zulu style, a compromise was arrived for granting Gordon the appointment of flying commander, with authority over the overall direction of all flying operations, but subordinate to IEFD. This compromise left Brooks-Smith as a principal staff officer with control over the aviation support function and as key advisor to Nixon, and gave Massey undisputed command of his squadron, but allowed Gordon to direct operations in the field and protected the independence of the Royal Naval Air Service detachment. The effect of this arrangement was to further compromise the fragile administration of the aviation capability. The situation came to a head following Townshend's withdrawal from Ctesiphon to Kut in early December 1915. A combination of a rapid retreat, lack of supplies and transport, and the attritional effect of the weather and high flying hours left the aviation capability without a single airworthy aircraft. Massey comments on these failings in the intelligence summary of No. 30 Squadron Royal Flying Corps War Diary for February 1916. His frustration with the staff and his chain of command is palpable. They enjoy the benefits of aviation, but fail to understand its fragility. As a result of this almost complete failure, the command arrangement was revisited, and on the 9th of March 1916, the Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service elements were effectively merged under the command of Gordon, but remained under Army authority. This arrangement received joint Admiralty and War Office approval. So what we have is a situation where a lack of air-mindedness, terrible climate, illness, lack of communications, old and fragile aircraft meant that as the siege of Kut went on, what the air element had to play with was extremely limited. Now we're going to move on to the actual resupply itself. I'm going to leave those images up. On the left, a rough plan of the defences of Kut-Al-Amara. In the centre, an actual image of aerial resupply going on, and on the right-hand side, an image of a BE-2C, a Blériot Experimental 2, aircraft dating back to 1911, with its load. If you look on the wing, you can see bags of flour tied to the load, and underneath on the bomb rack, you can just see the shadow of more bags of provisions. So Townshend's advance on Baghdad had been repulsed at Ctesiphon, as I said, on the 22nd of November 1915, and he'd rapidly withdrawn to the town of Kut-Al-Amara to resupply. His division arrived in the town on the 3rd of December and was surrounded by Ottoman forces 4 days later. Townshend accepted the siege as he believed he had stores and provisions sufficient for at least a month, and in the knowledge that the siege was, in effect, halting a potential Ottoman advance to Al-Amara and thence to Basra via Kurna. Every attempt by British troops to relieve the siege met with failure, due largely to a combination of stubborn Turkish resistance, limited numbers of available assaulting troops, insufficient supplies, and tenuous lines of communication, exacerbated by the annual flooding of the Tigris. By careful rationing and the planned butchery of draft animals and cavalry horses, Townsend's force was able to hold out until the 29th of April 1916, before surrendering to the Ottoman commander, General Halil Bey. A siege which Townsend expected to have lifted within 30 days had in fact lasted 147. It had cost the British 23,000 casualties and ended in the captivity of the Kut-Al-Amara garrison. Arguably, waiting until the 11th hour to provide aerial resupply limited the effect that resupply could bring, further highlighting a lack of understanding of air power. The first attempt at aerial resupply for Kut-Al-Amara involved the dropping of newspapers, parcels, and letters to Townsend's headquarters on the 31st of January 1916. There was nothing new in this, as we talked about earlier. The dropping of messages from aircraft had been commonplace since before the war, but it marks the first drop of any significance and the beginnings of an adaptation. By mid-February 1916, this activity had become commonplace, with aeroplanes regularly flying the 23.5 miles from the forward aerodrome at Ora near Sheikh Saad, dropping loads as diverse as wireless parts, fishing nets, medicine, and money. On the 4th of March 1916, number 30 Squadron RFC personnel began experimenting with dropping a millstone weighing 70 pounds using a parachute specially designed by Sergeant John Stubbs. This represents a departure from the routine and demonstrates the cumulative nature of learning in contact. The millstone was required to enable flour milling within Kut-Al-Amara because the Turks had taken them away before the British had occupied Kut originally in a year previously. It was tested and it was dropped by a B-2C aircraft, such as you can see on the right-hand side there, on the 27th of March 1916, successfully dropped. It's unclear who devised the idea of dropping food into Kut. There is some discussion, some debate over this, but probably the most likely person is Major Massey, the commander of the squadron, who came up with this. But the first experiments with aerial delivery of food took place on the 11th of April 1916 at Ora, with a working mechanism being in place for the 13th of April 1916, so 2 days later. Townsend granted permission to try the concept on the 14th of April 1916, stating that Kut-Al-Amara would receive around 5,000 pounds of foodstuff per day to hold out. So that's the requirement, 5,000 pounds. The aerial resupply effort commenced on the 15th of April 1916, and from then until the end of the siege, a fortnight later, number 30 Squadron managed to supply 19,000 pounds of food, although only 16,800 pounds could be recovered by the besieged troops. Townsend would later describe the aerial resupply effort as a complete failure. By April 1916, number 30 Squadron had 9 aircraft available for duty at Ora, 4 BE-2Cs, and the 3 Shorts aircraft that we saw earlier, and also a number of Henry Farmans. Although all of these would be used for aerial resupply, the vast majority of sorties were flown by land airplanes, largely because the seaplanes were relatively underpowered and had trouble rising and landing when burdened with a heavy load. Additionally, the different aircraft types had to be loaded differently according to their flying characteristics. BE-2Cs could carry 150 pounds and the Henry Farmans 200 pounds, with the Shorts and the Voisins significantly less. With the exception of the BE-2Cs, all loads were mounted on a modified bomb rack that was designed by Captain E.M. Murray, with loads being dropped from an altitude of between 5,000 and 6,000 feet. The BE-2Cs carried a 50-pound load on the improvised bomb rack and 50-pound loads on each lower wing alongside the pilot's seats, as we can see in the picture in the right. It's often thought that they use parachutes, and this is not this is not correct. Effectively, they used double-bagged bags. So a bag of flour placed inside an empty Lusa bag and dropped from 5,000 to 6,000 feet. That might sound ridiculous, but in actual fact, it was a highly effective method. If the inner bag burst, it was all captured by the outer bag. So the loss of stores was limited. So notwithstanding issues with engines and the lifting of loads from the Tigris, aerial resupply appears to have been more problematic for the Royal Naval Air Service than the Royal Flying Corps. Anecdotal evidence from inside Kut-Al-Amara is scathing regarding the ability of seaplanes to deliver the load to a marked dropping point. This criticism varies from humorous inter-service banter to annoyance at the RNAS's reticence to modify their airplanes. Whilst these anecdotes are hard to ignore, it is clear that the seaplanes did more than their share of the workload. In the period 17th to the 30th of April 1916, although RNAS seaplanes represented less than a third of the flying strength of the squadron, they completed almost 40% of the flying hours flown. To a degree, this is explained by the use of seaplanes for other tasks, specifically artillery support. But perhaps it was easier to criticize the more recognizable shape of a float plane than a land-based aeroplane when supplies were lost. So overall, in the period 15th to the 29th, number 30 squadron delivered 16,800 pounds of food into Kut, which represents about 22% of the overall requirement. This raw data is deceptive. On the first day of supply, they dropped 3,750 pounds of food into Kut, representing 75% of requirement. On the second day, in high winds and rain, they only managed 26%. But on average, aeroplanes delivered 1,600 pounds of food each day. It must be remembered, however, that prior to the start of the operation, it had been thought that aerial resupply was feasible. This indicates that a number of variables were either unforeseen or not included in the planning. These can be summarized as the effect of high flying hours on old airframes and tired aircrew, competing operational demands for the air service, adverse weather, and unfavorable climate. The number of flying hours performed by the 9 aeroplanes of number 30 squadron rose from 43 in the period 20, and this is 43 a week, in the period 20th to 25th of March 1916, to over 152 in the period 17th to the 23rd. General Percy Lake was well aware that the air service was operating with aircraft which, and I quote him, were obsolete and in need of repair. And Massey had warned in February 16 that given the age and disrepair of the equipment and enhanced servicing required, the workload demanded by Tigris column was unsustainable. It's clear that by April 1916, this problem would have likely have been more apparent. Indeed, on the 17th of April, no flying was possible because of issues with both the maintenance of the aircraft and the and illness amongst the pilots. So that rather encapsulates what happens in that part. What we're going to talk about now is the fact that how innovative these two squadrons are, and or this squadron is rather, and we're going to talk a little bit about photography and fighter direction. So both of these, aerial photography was commonly known, obviously on the Western Front, but in the heat of Mesopotamia, keeping the chemicals in the right place was a real difficulty. They got round this by placing Royal Engineer cartographers right on the airfield, so that as soon as a pilot was down, he could bring his sketch of the enemy positions to the engineer cartographers, who would then turn it into maps, and this improved the accuracy considerably. They also did do some aerial photography, contrary to what some other authors have written. Fighter direction is really interesting. They used some predetermined signals from from Kut, when they saw the German fighter planes, the Pfalz fighter planes, When they saw them lifting off, they used them. They used the signal to give idea of where the direction was of the aircraft and what it was doing. And so that enabled British aircraft to be up in the air much quicker than they would have been. And that sort of idea of fighter direction by messaging would not become common until the Second World War. So those are 2 points that point to just how innovative this force had become. So in many ways, development of air power in the Mesopotamian theatre was homogeneous, evolving to adapt to local conditions and demands. A military Galapagos, you might say. Its dependence on innovation was a function of the shortages and other weaknesses it faced. It adapted in order to solve problems pragmatically, creating largely bespoke solutions. On several occasions, these solutions were rejected by the War Office because the solution was at odds with common practice in France and Belgium. But rather, the idea of posting cartographers was initially rejected because cartography was not a recognized function of operational units, but rather a matter for an intelligence branch at a headquarters. So the question is, was it a complete failure? And we'll come back to that shortly. So now we've got what we call a tale of two technicians. And it's often said that whilst there was absolutely no formal contact between the Western Front and Mesopotamia, and they did not receive the doctrine notes, if you like, that everyone else was seeing. There is what I was able in my research to identify common threads. There were connections, and I'll draw on these two. So first of all, Captain W.R. Wills, as you remember, is the engineering technician of 30 Squadron. He's responsible for the development of the dropping mechanics, if you like. And Lieutenant Lawrence Wackett, Army Flying Corps, who would later go on to become the father of the Australian aircraft industry. So Wills gets posted when Mesopotamia shuts down after the siege of Kut is over, gets posted to number 30 Squadron back in Egypt, and they're based alongside number 1 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps. Now, it is Wackett is both a pilot and an engineer, and what I am suggesting is that, as well as the well-documented attempt, it was in the newspapers, it was in Flight magazine, if you like, of the time, that this capability was going on. It became quite apparent that these two people were working alongside each other. Indeed, later in late 1917, both of them are posted to the Orford Ness Research Establishment, looking at researching into aircraft. We know at this stage that Wackett is heavily into modification of aircraft. In fact, he modifies a machine gun mount on a BE-2C, which becomes highly successful and enables him to shoot down Turkish aircraft in Palestine. But in France in 1918, he gets moved to number 3 AFC, and Will stays at Orford Ness in Suffolk. The question then is that to what degree is Lawrence Wackett's idea, and you'll see that in a moment, connected to the ideas of what happened at Kut and the way that they resupplied. So the next part is going to be just talking a little bit around the subject of the context for 1918. So obviously after the failure of the German spring offensives, everything sort of comes to a halt, and there is a political decision, obviously, to no more reinforcements to go to France, wait for the Americans, and that means that the British commanders are forced to depend on material and technology, tanks, aircraft, all those sorts of things, to make up for the gap of manpower. At a tactical level, the battlefield is very different. So the trench lines are not as organized as they were in 1917. They're very much more ad hoc. But the questions still remain. These strong points still need to be overcome. And at a tactical level, the two important questions are, how do you get across that final 100 yards using deception, surprise, precision artillery, and the German counterattack? That would always happen, and you had to have mass and combat resupply to blunt that attack when it came in. That would effectively determine your success in any attack. So we're going to move on to the Battle of Hamel in 4th of July 1918. So before I talk about Hamel in detail, I'm just going to make a wider point about Hamel. You'll have seen, I think I've put various points out in the last few days on social media. There is a school of thought, in particular Australia, that the Battle of Le Hamel was an Australian victory, a pure Australian victory, and that it was even that it was an Australian and American victory. What I would say to that is that, without denigrating at all the valour and the aggression of the Australian infantry, which was a really key factor in this battle, they are supported by British tanks. The 600 artillery pieces that support this action are British and French, and the majority of the air squadrons supporting that are British aircraft. So this is the success of this, which is down to the planning of Monash and Rawlinson, and is down to the aggression of the Australian infantry, and also the hard work of the artillery and armour to create a fully combined arms battle. And you can see from the picture on the right just the degree to which that is true. So I'm just going to quickly orientate you across the battlefield that we see here. Okay, so in the northwest corner we have the town of Corby. Running along the very top of the slide, you can see that would be the River Somme, which is fairly canalised at this point. Down in the south is in the southwest is Villers-Bretonneux, and in the southeast is Vafouze-Avancourt. You can see in the centre top the town of Le Hamel, or rather a large village of Le Hamel. And after the Germans were stopped at Villers-Bretonneux in April 1918, the Germans were left with a salient of land. It may not look very significant, but if you imagine that Le Hamel itself as a town sits in a horseshoe of hills, and that the hill to its front, so the hill to its west with a small top on it, with a small tree, small wood, allows visuals both all the way across the Villers-Bretonneux in enfilade, and also all the way up to Bouzencourt in enfilade. In other words, this small point represents a difficulty for the Allies, because it means that they can, any action, any activity along that line can be seen and prepared for by the Germans. So the Germans have laid this position out on that hill to the west of Hamel. They've set up two strong points, Pear Trench and Kidney Trench. You can't see Kidney Trench on this map. Kidney Trench is just to the north of Hamel and Vere Wood. When the attacks go in, they crash through Pear Trench and Kidney Trench. They are held up quite significantly at Bear Trench, but eventually break through. And the Germans, about 2,500 Germans, are holding the front line, with most of them in Bear and Kidney trenches. And when they break, they head back into Hamel. This causes general confusion because the rushing on of the tanks, the rushing on of the Australian infantry, and the precise artillery means that the Germans generally make a break for it and leave the Australians where the current Australian Memorial is, just outside Hamel, and holding on the position of the Wolfsburg. It's planned by Monash to take 90 minutes. It takes 93, but he achieves all his objectives and all his aims by combining what he needs to do. So it's a highly successful battle, and aerial resupply plays its part. So the Battle of Le Hamel was perhaps the first combined arms battle, taking a lot away from the from battles such as Cambrai, but it is perhaps the first combined arms battle, and it's characterized by the use of surprise and deception to disorientate the enemy prior to the assault, the cooperation of tanks and infantry supported by artillery and airplanes, and mechanized logistic support provided by supply tanks and airplanes providing aerial resupply. The offensive is meticulously planned by Monash and later the subject of a pamphlet, SS-218J, by notes compiled by General Staff of 4th Army Operations by the Australian Corps against Le Hamel, Bois de Hamel, and Bois de Vert on the 4th of July 1918. Once again, highlighting a mature organization with a highly developed system of knowledge management, the contrast with Mesopotamia could hardly have been deeper. Le Hamel was a resounding success, as I said, with everything, with all objectives achieved in 93 minutes, and it was arguably the template for the Battle of Amiens a month later, and all subsequently successful British Dominion operations in the 100 Days Campaign. Aviation support at Le Hamel was highly experimental, with roles including tank support by No. 8 Squadron Royal Air Force and aerial resupply provided by No. 9 Squadron Royal Air Force, as well as ground attack, artillery cooperation, reconnaissance and fighter support carried out by No. 3 Squadron Australian Flying Corps and Numbers 101 and 251 Squadrons Royal Air Force. No. 9 Squadron Royal Air Force was a core squadron, that is a squadron temporarily allocated to duties directly in support of the corps to which it was attached. As such, it was a natural choice for aerial resupply. On the 4th of July 1918, 12 RE-8 aeroplanes from the squadron were fitted with Wackett's apparatus, so Wackett has invented this, and took part in the aerial resupply of 4th Australian Division. And we can see where they are on the map. They had prepared 150 1,200 round ammunition boxes for loading, and that took about 144 man-hours, whilst the preparation of 30 parachutes and subsequent loading took a further 45 man-hours. The overall task was completed in 15 hours. During operations, 12 aeroplanes could deliver 4 drops of 2 ammunition boxes per plane with an aforementioned preparation. A potential capacity of 96 ammunition boxes, or just over 115,000 rounds of small arms, could be delivered. Jonathan Boff estimates that a quantity of 60,000 rounds would be sufficient to resupply a battalion of infantry, with the contents of 96 boxes almost sufficient to fully resupply 2 battalions. Jonathan Boff doesn't take into account, however, that small arms ammunition resupply was purely for the heavy machine guns, not for riflemen. Ammunition and firepower would thus be concentrated and far more effective. But he does note that a small amount of ammunition at a critical time can prove decisive. So on the 4th of July, there were very few cases of boxes failing to release, and those that did were the result of poorly fabricated apparatus. The loads would drop from an average height of 800 feet and often fell, and I quote, right into the machine gun pits. The aeroplanes dropped loads both to planned dumps and to isolated machine gun posts, which displayed a V marker. Each aeroplane were allocated to supply the pre-designated dumps, and 8 aeroplanes were allocated to supply pre-designated dumps, and 4 to act as rovers to supply those posts displaying a V. The reloading and maintenance of the aeroplanes took around 20 minutes, with time between dropping one load and returning 50 minutes. On the 4th of July, number 9 Squadron dropped 93 boxes, or 111,600 rounds of small arms ammunition. Once again, the superior knowledge basis is evident from the detail provided by both Wackett in his report on the trials and his apparatus to Fire Brigade on the 21st of June, and in Rodwell's report on the 7th of July 1918. So we know that they've dropped this amount of ammunition, and it's important to understand what is thought about this as it goes. So promulgation of the capability following the Battle of Le Hamel was extremely rapid, both within the British and Dominion air services and to the Allied air services in the United States and Belgium. Arguably more remarkable was the reflective adaptation of the capability whilst in contact with the enemy following the battle, and the degree to which influence and resource was provided to support it. The general perception of the success of air resupply at Le Hamel, set in context with the new semi-fluid conditions present on the Western Front, and the generous support expressed by the Corps and Army commanders, opened up a still greater resource. On the 7th of July 1918, the RAF Balloon Repair Unit at Arc was requested by HQ RAF in France to provide 2,000 parachutes to Wackett's specification for the supply for air resupply, requiring approximately 210,000 square feet of unbleached calico. The total stock available was not more than 5,500 square yards, and on the 11th of July, HQ RAF tasked the Air Force representative in Paris to source the fabric and urgently make good the shortfall. These demands suggest a close integration between the Army and the Air Force, with the latter service operationally focused on supporting the other. It also suggests that both the Army and the Air Force were making aerial resupply a considerable priority at an early stage, with little empirical evidence of operational efficiency, thus demonstrating both confidence in the capability and in their own highly effective knowledge exploitation procedures. It should be noted that this level of support was not limited to the aerial resupply capability, being mirrored by significant and rapid support to the close air support of tanks as well. 3 significant lessons were extracted from aerial resupply at Le Hamel. 2 of these directly benefited the machine gun crews, and 1 was devised for the protection of aircrew. First, it was decided that the fabric which the parachutes were made of would be doped with kutch. This is like a brown bricky color, and it's assumed that this was there in an attempt to camouflage the parachute on the ground, so as not to give away machine gun positions to German artillery observation. Second, the 4th Army General Instruction for the Battle of Amiens contains an addendum in the part dealing with aviation, stating that all aerial resupply aircraft would have the last 2.5 feet of the lower plane tip painted black. This is so it could be seen from below, and so that the V-shaped dropping signal would not be put out until the very last moment. Finally, on the first day of the Battle of Amiens, number 9 Squadron delivered its supplies behind us a phosphorus smoke screen. Whilst this would clearly benefit the machine gun crews on the ground, it would have provided a degree of cover from view and thus afforded the airplane some protection. At Amiens, 18 boxes of ammunition, 21,600 rounds, were delivered in this way. 2 seconds. So none of that support through the last 100 days, in the last 100 days campaign, every single day, between 30 and 60,000 rounds of ammunition were dropped by the Australians, rather by the Royal Air Force. Australian opinion on the effectiveness of aerial resupply is divided. The lower you go down the rank scale, the more impressed they are with it. At higher echelons, they tend to see it as not necessarily being so effective. British opinion is very different. This comes to the attention of General Sir Herbert Lawrence, who we had a talk about last month, and he wants this really, really supporting. So much so that 8 days later, this whole plan and the schematics and the designs have been given completely to the US and Belgium and France and Italy. They've said, this is a good idea, you should get on with it. And although the Belgian and Italian designs vary and the French design are slightly different, the idea is taken up by them as well. Over the next 100 days in the 100 Days campaign, we see, as I say, 30 to 60,000 rounds a day. And in September, in the attacks on the Hindenburg line, it is requested that heavy bombers be fitted out with the ability to drop supplies. And that would have been an enormous step forward. It was called off because the American battalion that had found itself caught up and surrounded by Germans was able to evacuate itself. So the resupply was not necessary. Oh, sorry. Okay, so there is a controversy. And I'm going to wind it back a little bit to the points that we've talked about earlier. So Kut-Al-Amara who kind of give the official view, claim that rather than Mesopotamia, the inspiration for aerial resupply originated from a German document captured during the Spring Offensive of 1918. The summary in which the captured document appears dates from the 19th of June 1918, and it's translated from a French document captured into French. So it's translated from French into English, and it comes from a document captured by French 10th Army on the 12th of June. The date of the original German document being the 24th of May. So it's problematic because, first of all, the type of supply that the Germans were doing, which is effectively dropping a wicker basket without a parachute, is very different to the Wacket model, which is a gear for dropping, which allows the dropping and looks very much more similar to the Kut experience. But it also comes too late. So by the time that anyone would have read that after the 19th of June, Wacket had already done his first tests of his new mechanism. So in other words, the idea doesn't come from the Germans, it comes from Wacket, or does it? And so this is the question. We've already talked earlier about the amount of time that Wacket would have spent with people like Wills, etc. And I think where we are on that is that although it can't be definitively proved that he got a large amount of his ideas, it seems awfully convenient that he spends time working with Wills in Egypt and in Suffolk, and then comes up with this idea. Wacket was to receive a large financial prize for coming up with this idea after the war. So where do we end up? So you'd think that this idea, which was dropping 30 to 60,000 rounds a day, would become a general idea. Well, unfortunately not. As after the war, with inter-service rivalry, lack of funding for both services, what you end up with is any attempt to support the army basically disappearing from the Royal Air Force's role. From 1920, it becomes really important colonial policing and air bombing becomes really important to the Royal Air Force, more so than Army cooperation. And you watch it through the 1920s and 1930s, slowly disappearing from the emerging Royal Air Force doctrine. There is an attempt to resupply at Kabul in 1928 when the British embassy is surrounded, again in Afghanistan, surprise, surprise. But that is really a one-off. The next time we see it being used, we see it arriving with Slim and the RAF and the birth of Air Resupply in Burma, although it had been used by the Australians again earlier in the Far East. And that is where it goes to. So it disappears from view largely because the Air Force is fighting for its survival against its two parents, the Navy and the Army, and they find a niche in colonial policing and decide to exploit it. That is that. So, was aerial resupply effective in the Great War? Well, I have to say that I have to agree with Michael Morkentin in general. I think that aerial resupply was effective at points, but it was never going to change the outcome. One supply tank can carry as much supplies as 1,200 men. What we're talking about here is aircraft worth carrying probably what 2 men could carry. So in other words, it's not the answer, but it does show how important this could become. So why is the effort at Kut seen as a complete failure? It seems a complete failure because Charles Townsend wanted it to be seen as a complete failure. He needed something to blame for the failure at Kut, and he blamed aerial resupply. I think I've demonstrated that on a good day, with a fair wind, they could probably have resupplied. And had they been started earlier, they could probably have extended that siege. So I think that's the reason for that. What do Kut and Le Hamel have to say about the importance of patronage? Well, the interesting thing is, aerial resupply is no more effective at Le Hamel than it was at Kut. But it gets patronage. It gets senior officers from the CGS all the way down, Monash, the various commanders are behind it. And because they're behind it, it gets a push. At Kut, no one is interested. By the time the positive reports get to London in July, in the first week of July 1916, the British Army has other things to be thinking about. And it just doesn't get that vital patronage it needs to be extended and developed. And how important are informal networks in the Great War? Well, I think we've been able to prove that Wackett and Wills and had informal contacts, which were far stronger than pamphlets and doctrine documents. Indeed, probably newspapers are far more important than both of those things. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Paul, very many thanks indeed for that super presentation about an area of the First World War that we're so very unfamiliar with. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we'd like to raise our hands in the time-honoured way by, doing a round of applause in the time-honoured way by raising our hands on Zoom, that would be tremendous. Thanks very much, Paul. I can confirm that there's hundreds of hands going up as a virtual round of applause, so thanks for that. Question and answer time. We've got a number of questions already, which is fantastic. So thanks for those. Barry, hello there. Barry from whereabouts are you? It's WFA East Coast in USA. So you're obviously joining us from America.
Yes, I just finished 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence, in which he expressed the opinion that had the War Office allocated another 8 aircraft, Townsend could have held out indefinitely. Any reality? Any comment on that?
So I think there's something in that. I think he probably another 8 aircraft of the right type and fit aircrew. I think it almost definitely could have held that, and that makes an even stronger point for why people see this as a failure, Barry. So I would tend to agree with Lawrence on that.
Thanks for that, Paul. Thanks for your question there, very much appreciated. Patrick Hammer. Patrick, are you able to?
Yeah. No, I had 2 questions, and one was first of all that I'd never heard of the Royal Marines Light Infantry having aircraft. Actually, to me that was. Did they have a large aerial contingent as such within the Royal Marines, or were they just part of the Royal Naval Air Service?
So Patrick, Gordon was an officer of the Royal Marine Light Infantry who was working within the Royal Naval Air Service. So it wasn't a Royal Marine aircraft; it was a Royal Navy aircraft. But he was just an officer seconded across it, if you like.
Okay, sorry. And the other thing was, I noticed that you talked about the Martin side, which was, of course, obsolete, being in 1915, it was already 4 years old, which by then meant about 5 generations back, more or less.
Yeah.
But my question was, did the other more modern types that entered, did they actually fare much better, considering the hot climate, which would affect performance, such as climb and speed and such like?
It would have been difficult to overcome those things, but the point is, I think that nothing dating after 1914 made its way out to Mesopotamia, and in those circumstances, had some of the later aircraft been available, they probably would have had greater performance. The main problem is, of course, that with 8 or 9 aircraft doing 140 hours a week in those climates with that technology, you are on a hiding to nothing with that. You need better aircraft, and you need more pilots.
Thank you very much, and thank you for an amazing talk there.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you. Andy Jones. Andy, do you want to just unmute yourself there?
Yeah, Paul, thank you for a peerless and unsurprisingly insightful brief.
Thanks.
In some ways, my sort of question was preempted. It was more I'm still struggling to see how the lessons were not identified or weaved through, and it was, we get to Slim before the lessons are hoisted in with that. And I think from your closing statements, I think it's probably linked to patronage. We've seen Hage early on in exercise weaving the aerial resupply piece in. I suppose it's fair to say that, not until Slim was that being woven in again, really.
Yeah. But the main point of that is that the Air Force is fighting for its life. Even at the end of the war, it was not clear that the Air Force was going to survive. And Trenchard really got behind the idea of finding a USP which would keep it against its political masters. And I think the Army is probably struggling in that same way today of trying to find a USP that the Navy and the Air Force have, and trying to find that. So what you end up with is this the finance drives it. The Air Force finds a way of conducting operations and keeping itself alive, which is colonial air policing, and it goes with that. And that means that everything else goes to one side, apart from obviously bombing, which continues on as a part. But everything else gets pushed to one side to enable that one thing, and that's why a resupply disappears. The Air Force are really anti picking it up again with Slim, and that's why today the Army do the aerial delivery part, and the aircraft are flown by the Air Force. It's because the Air Force said, there's no way you're using our manpower to throw things out of aircraft. So Slim said, it's all right. I've got some Indian Army Service Corps boys. They'll toss it out the window. And that is why today we still have the arrangement of aircraft flown by the Royal Air Force, but the proper stuff coming out the back is all Army.
Brilliant. Thank you. Great brief. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for that. Mark Smith, off you go.
Hello, Paul. Thank you very much for that. That was fantastic, and I learned a lot there. A little controversial. I'd like to say that the RAF, being more intelligent, have the better roles, and they lead the way in good old Mr. Trenchard back in 1918. I guess that leads on to my question, really, where the RAF was obviously in its infancy then.
Yes.
Did the Royal Flying Corps, I guess they didn't bode well together, but did the Flying Corps, did they actually do any air dispatching? Did they do many trials and things before the RAF came into force? You know, the more intelligent service I'm talking here, you know, jokingly, controversially. Mine was Air Force, obviously, so, and I did logistics, and I've done, obviously, dispatching, throwing things out the back of Hercules as well, you know, so it's not just Army that do that sort of stuff, so... the Royal Flying Corps, did they bode well with the Royal Air Force in the early days?
No, I think the problem is that there's no learning process across the whole Royal Flying Corps, in the same way as there's no learning process across the whole Royal Air Force at this stage. This is down to small groups inventing things, and if they're lucky, getting to take the subject on a little bit further.
Yes.
And so no. What's really terrible, to my mind, is Aero Resupply is reported in Flight Magazine in April 1916. It's also being talked about quite widely, but the official report doesn't arrive until the first week of July 1916. Now, I'm not really into counterfactual history, but I give those of you who are SOM experts a little snippet. Imagine if they'd taken the idea in April 16, fitted aircraft out when we had complete air superiority over the Somme on the first day, what would have happened with the 36 Ulsters had they been able to be resupplied with ammunition from the air?
Well, it's unbelievable, isn't it?
But, I mean, this is what happens when you don't have a good learning process, because it's really vital. And I think those of us with any Army experience know that the idea of learning and lessons learned process is absolutely vital.
A good old quality system does that, doesn't it? Having lessons learned, and you know, we sit around the table afterwards, don't we? But it's a fantastic, and it has stimulated my thought, you know, on resupply and stuff like that. So I would like to say, can you have a pilot and an engineer? Because don't really believe you can, because a pilot is a pilot and he wants his thing. The engineer will know.
I think
cautious.
I think back in those days it was entirely possible, because people were enthusiasts for the air, and they would repair their own aircraft on the ground.
Brilliant. All right, thank you very much indeed. Anyway, I could go on for ages, but I won't.
Thank you, Mark.
Cheers. Anyway, cheers, Paul. Cheers.
Thanks, Mark. Alan Wood. Alan.
Hello, Chippy.
Barney, you didn't think you were going to get away with me talking to you?
No, I knew you.
We should have been on the Somme about a year ago now, so
we should
for our last trip. But hey ho, so mine's actually right down to the weeds, really, and the Australians, and you and I have argued over the Australians and their bit for, like, I know, years. I think it probably is now. But what do you think the difference is between the digger and the commanders? Was it because the diggers were more interested in what mattered to them, those three key combat supply: food, water, ammunition? They're getting ammunition dropped, they don't care how it happens, whereas the Australian commanders, with their different agenda, are looking for aircraft to affect an operational change on the battlefield, which they simply are not capable of doing in 1918.
I think, Chippy, you've probably hit the nail on the head. I think the reason why it's so enthusiastically supported at the lower level is because with a lower and tighter focus, just getting that ammo and food is great. And we have that today. Your average soldier doesn't care about whether the drops vehicle is operationally efficient. He just cares about whether he gets his supply or not. And that is about focus with soldiers at a tactical level being focused on the tactics, and officers at a high operational strategic levels thinking about things in a different way. And that's that disjoint, which perhaps, we can look at the whole First World War and you can see that disjoint. What's important to the man in the trench is not necessarily important to the man further up, and then you get all that tension between the brass and the red tabs and soldiers. So I think yes, I think that's probably correct.
Yeah, the operational, and it's so good to see you.
Yeah, it's brilliant to see you, Chippy.
Yeah, take care.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for that. John Azar. John, hello there.
Hi, welcome from West Coast of Canada.
Good for you to join us
Paul.
all that way away.
It's noon here, so it's easy. Paul, the relative success at Kut, you mentioned 5,000 feet versus 800 at Hamel. So how conservative was that 5,000 feet? And how much more successful would the drop rate be if they were down at 4, 3, 2, 1, 800?
I mean, it is interesting because I think what it's there for is those aircraft are pretty flimsy. They are incredibly slow. And I think that with the Turks so close to the position, they were probably trying to use altitude to try and keep out of the way of small arms fire.
What's the elevation for a machine gun?
Oh my word!
Against an airplane, roughly.
Well, it rather depends on. In those days, they didn't have any mounts, so what they would do is just literally mount it on a wall and fire it upwards. So it'd be pretty inaccurate, but still, deciding to keep it at those sorts of heights is as a protection method. Whereas later on, obviously at Hamel, they've learned that if you're already suppressing ground fire using aircraft and artillery, you can get much lower. It's not wildly accurate. At 8,000 feet, some's falling in the Tigris, some's falling in the Turkish lines, some's falling in the center of Kut, whereas 800 feet in Le Hamel, they are literally getting it bang straight into the gun pits, if you like.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to get at how overly conservative was the 5,000 feet.
I think probably they were being conservative. Because they were aware that they only had 9 aircraft left, and that they needed every single one. So I think it probably is conservative. They could have come down lower. They could probably have flown at different times of the day. Close to sunset would have made it more difficult, or because of the sun dropping in the west. So they could have done all sorts, but they stuck with their 3,000 to 5,000 feet, 5,000 to 8,000 feet. Sorry.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for joining us. David Muir.
Hello. Thank you for a very interesting talk. And my question really looks very much beyond the period that you're looking at. You did mention some of the things in World War II. I mean, and there we had the total failure of the Germans to resupply Stalingrad. There was the success at Kohima, and even more so, arguably, the American success in flying the hump. And then, after World War II, the Berlin airlift. Can you make any comments on how those might have developed from what happened in World War One?
Certainly the aerial dropping and other parts. So after the war, or later on in the First World War, later on we have the ability to take wounded out on aircraft, and so there is all these ideas developed before the First World War. They get some exposure during the First World War. They really don't come on until aircraft come on in the 30s and 40s and beyond. But there are lessons that are pertinent to that even today. So one of the key problems at Kut was the 2 German Pfalz fighters which were able to engage the aircraft carrying supplies. And the point here is aerial resupply and resupply in general is something that can be used successfully, but you do have to have aerial superiority because those aircraft are vulnerable. And so I think, that lesson is learnt in 1916, but then takes forever to be learnt afterwards. At Stalingrad, the Germans are trying to use bombers, medium bombers, and some small transport aircraft to feed a garrison many, many, many times larger than Kut. So I think it's very different, and they don't have air superiority. They have kind of a superiority, but only just. And so I think you are in there are different positions. So I think air superiority, air supremacy are absolutely needed if you're going to drop supplies. Even today, I think that's probably true.
Great, thanks, Paul. David, thanks for your question there. Stephen Rees. Stephen, do you want to unmute yourself? Stephen, fire away.
Just on that. Paul, good evening.
Hello, Stephen.
Fascinating talk, particularly on Hamel, which is where my question is directed to.
Yeah.
I remember reading stuff by, I think it's Ellen Cresswell from Sydney University about the small arms ammunition drops and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Were the small arms drop sites, or drop zones rather, predetermined in Monash's plan? Because presumably infantry and machine gunners required different caliber ammunition. So therefore the aircraft would have to know, how did the ground forces sort of liaise with the aircraft to say, well, actually we're infantry, we need that caliber now as we're advancing, within the 93 minutes of the battle.
So the caliber's predetermined. So it is .303, Mark 7, which can be used in short magazine Lee Enfields and can be used in Vickers machine guns. So the ammunition is always going to be the same. In the plan, they have got some predetermined sites, which they think about, and they say, well, yes, we'll drop it on the predetermined site, but only if we see the V panel on the ground to prove that it's you and not the Germans. So that again is huge forward thinking. Perhaps they could have adopted something like that at Arnhem. If there's that, and then there's also for the roving aircraft. So the roving aircraft that are flying around the battlefield with their little black markers on the end of their wings, so that machine gun teams, as they're starting to run out of ammunition, can look for one of those aircraft and put a V sign out, which will bring them some more ammunition. And 110, 111,000 rounds of ammunition at the right moment is absolutely critical, because not having it, you're defeated. Having it gives you a fighting chance, and that gives you that ability.
I remember that one of the larger drop zones was quite close to the Kidney Trench.
Yeah.
In the wood area behind it. The ground pre-pandemic, and I was struck by, gosh, they must have carefully thought where to drop this for it to be particularly effective.
Yeah, indeed, and I mean, anyone who's walked the battlefield of Hamel, and I've done that several times, will notice as well, actually, how flimsy. Once Kidney and Pear Trench are done, the battle's finished. And so it's right that they pick out Kidney and Pear Trench. If you can get your supplies into there, you have overwatch over Hamel, and the Germans have no alternative than to pull back.
That's right.
And when the tanks pull round Ver Wood and go up onto the Kemmelberg, there is there's no chance.
It's a straight run in.
It is a straight run in. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. Thank you. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you. Patrick, you got a second question?
Thank you so much. sorry for pestering you with questions, Mr. Barnes.
It's all right, Patrick. Thank you.
No, I was wondering about you. You said that they had quite different experiences in the Belgian and Italian air corps as regards as pertains to aerial resupply. And when I did my bachelor thesis, I did it on the Italian army along the Isonzo River, and there was actually very little in the official sources that I had access to that even mentioned aerial resupply as such.
Yeah, so some of it, some of it I managed to find in the National Archives, and only by trolling through the diaries for the Air Force squadrons that were working with the Italians. But in essence, that German idea looks very similar to the first French use at Chateau Vendière later in July. The Belgians use a system that looks like the British system, and so do the Americans, and they use it very successful, the French, at the Fifth Battle of Ypres. And then again, in the back end of October, November, the Italians are using a system which is all of their own. As you'd imagine, the Italians and design probably designed themselves something very different. But the concept was definitely passed to the Italians in July of 1918.
Okay, thank you very much. No, because I'm always trying to improve on what I already had, and that was to me that was I never even heard of it, so it was new.
It's so little. Yeah, there is so little, Patrick. There's very little, even the diaries, and you have to really pick it out and put it together from a mosaic of primary documents to work out what's going on.
Well, that's a problem. Being in Sweden, I don't have, unfortunately, very much access to the National Archives.
Indeed. Neither do we at the moment, so that makes
true. Thank you so much for your reply, though. This has given me another venue to explore furthermore.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you. Ted Cooper, do you want to just unmute yourself there, Ted?
Paul, that was really, really interesting stuff. I'm not familiar with the fighting in this region at all, but back in 1966, I did pay a personal visit to Baghdad and was hanging around that area for a couple of weeks. So I did get some feeling for the climate and everything. What I was interested in more particularly, though, was your comment about the force being divided into both the Tigris and the Euphrates front. And we didn't hear anything really about the Euphrates side of things. And I was wondering, how far did they get? And noting
the answer is
the railways extended all the way from Baghdad down the Euphrates side to Basra. Were they available at that time? And would that be another supporting route?
So the answer was that they did move up the Euphrates, but not very far. What happened was, because the Tigris force was moved so rapidly, and then it was repelled so rapidly, it became a crisis that didn't last very long in terms of an advance. With all of the effort going up the Tigris, what I would say about this is, about the historiography of all this, is that it's not very well covered at all. There are many, many books on Mesopotamia, most of which say the same thing, virtually word for word.
Right.
The primary research in this area is really poor. And so there's virtually nothing said about Mesopotamia, about the Euphrates force. And that, again, is an area that probably needs to be looked at further.
Okay. It was quite interesting, as I was alluding, the fact that along that particular route, I believe the railways were in place quite early on, and potentially, if they could have pressed further that way, the resupply angle would be much less of a problem.
Yeah, but I think that it comes down to exploiting the force which was moving quickest.
Yes, yes.
And the force that was largest. And so they've gone with that rather than the alternative. They don't even use the alternative Euphrates route in 1917 when they move up to Baghdad, when they counterattack, if you like. They mainly stick to the Tigris. So it's it's a fascinating thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted, for your question there. Thank you. Very last question from William Rosenfeld, and that from the daylight coming through your window, I can imagine that you're not in the same continent as we are here.
I am in Eastern Canada. At Hamel, the planning was done by Monash and the Australians. How did the air function fit into that planning?
So this again is part of this controversy. So the idea for the Battle of Hamel comes from above, doesn't come from Monash.
No, I understand that.
Rawlinson is given the minute planning, but it's all overseen by Rawlinson's army. So he's feeding in the Air Force elements, the French and British artillery, 600 artillery pieces, all French and British, have to be fed into Monash's plan. And Monash is taking the concepts and ideas and doing the minute planning with it. So it really does show the degree to which this is an improvement. And it also shows the degree to which armies are able to combine their efforts because they're talking to each other and they understand each other. I think that's probably the biggest part. As Monash says about pulling his orchestra together, I mean, he is literally pulling his orchestra together from the various nations. And I think it's a shame. So just to reiterate a point I made earlier, I think it's a shame when one nation tries to say this is ours. I was sent an image from a terrible book that says Australian and American victory. There were less than 200 Americans in that battle, and they all were infanteers against 19,000 Australians. So to try to play politics with this, I think is really, really poor. And the truth is, it is a combined arms action with most of the nations taking part in that battle, as it did at Amiens. And so why people feel the need to sort of say this is an Australian victory or this is a British victory, I think it's better to say that this is a coalition victory.
I wasn't attempting to state that.
No, I know. No, I know you won't. I know you won't, William. I was just saying that
I was searching.
That's my wider point.
Yeah, I was searching for the answer you provided, which is
thanks, mate.
That
was just.
And that there was no inter-service rivalry. There was no seeking for place.
No, because the RAF in 1918 basically bleeds khaki. It is still the Royal Flying Corps in a different uniform, or with different ranks, but it is essentially the army, and so they understand each other, and they understand each other intimately.
Thank you for that.
Splendid.
Thanks, William.
Very much for your question there, William. Fantastic. Right, ladies and gentlemen, it is now 9:30 UK time, so it's the time for us to shut up shop, I'm afraid. Paul, that was tremendous. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Really good Q&A session as well. So that is first class. And I thoroughly enjoyed this evening learning something that I didn't know. So I'm not pretending that I now know it, but at least I now know what I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, David. And let's hope that people sort of take a look at aerial resupply as it deserves to be looked at.
Indeed, and once again, a final round of applause for Paul, please, via the virtual hand-raising routine, and the hands are shooting up there. So that's the final round of applause for the evening. And just to say briefly that the next WFA webinar is on Monday with Gordon Corrigan talking about mud, blood and poppycock. If you've not already registered for that, I'm afraid it's too late. We have a full house for Monday night, but please do turn up. If you cannot make it on Monday, please do release your place via the cancellation button, as that will enable anybody who has failed to get on board for Monday to do so. But Paul, again, finally, thanks very much indeed for a wonderful evening. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and stay safe.
Thank you, David, and you.
Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hinky, pinky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hinky, pinky, parlez-vous. The officers get all